Long and I are pleased to introduce today's seminar speaker, Dr. Suzanne Pierre, in the first of this mini-series. So we have 3 more talks after this. Yeah, I'm really pleased to see how big the attendance is today. So just a little bit about Dr. Pierre. She is a global change ecologist and biogeochemist, and also a decorated scholar. She's currently an Osher Fellow at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco and director of the Critical Ecology Lab. Prior to joining the California Academy of Sciences, she was an environmental scientist and educator at the Exploratorium in San Francisco and was awarded the UC Berkeley Presidential Postdoctoral Fellowship. She got her PhD at Cornell in the EEB department and her bachelor's degree from New York University. So I was introduced to Dr. Pierre's work through an interview she did on one of my favorite podcasts, in which she discussed how human interactions with nature, mediated by science, labor, and freedom, have influenced local and global exchanges of elements, energy, and social and economic power. I was really inspired by her thoughtful critiques of our field and how she brought attention to the historical and contemporary extractive and oppressive social systems and processes that contribute to global environmental change. Before we get started with the talk, I just wanted to, just some logistical things. If you have any questions throughout the talk, please put them in the Q&A box. And then if you're also joining us from outside the Carey Institute, feel free to put your location in the chat box. And yeah, without any further ado, I'll switch it over to Dr. Pierre.
Thank you so much, Bella. Yeah, thank you, Bella and Michelle, for inviting me to come join you virtually at the Carey Institute. It's such a delight, and I've always wanted to come and speak at the Carey, so this is a real treat. I'm going to start sharing my screen now because I think that's what I'm supposed to do. Yes. All right. So, as Bella said, my interests lie in thinking about how humans interact with nature, but in particular how our ideological and cultural backgrounds and biases and histories really shape our discipline and ultimately shape what it is we conceive of to measure when it comes to global change. So my name is Suzanne, my pronouns are she and her. And my topic of today is defining socio-biophysical drivers of environmental change. So Bella did a very nice introduction, so I don't need to spend too much time, but I thought I'd share a little bit of my background. As mentioned, I received my bachelor's from New York University in environmental studies, and I got to work with some wonderful people at that time. Dr. Mary Killelea, who some of you know, and actually had my first research experience at the Carey Institute in the Groffman Lab. And I had just such a wonderful formative experience working with folks like Lisa Martell and Neil Battez and others. And I just wanted to express my gratitude, and just the positive experience that I had was very formative for me. So thank you, Peter and Lisa. I then went on to receive a PhD at Cornell University in EEB, working with wonderful people like Tim Fahey, and again, Peter Groffman as my co-advisor for my PhD. I spent some time at UC Berkeley in the President's Postdoctoral Fellowship, and I'm distracted by the chat. Oh my goodness, so many people. Wow. After having a postdoctoral fellowship in the Dawson Lab, where I was really focused on plant physiology with relation to soil microbiomes, I took a position as an environmental scientist and educator at the Exploratorium Museum. That was short-lived, as it turns out. I am not a museum educator in my soul, but that experience actually gave way to my time thinking about how best to make next steps in my career that allowed me to pursue both basic science and these important critical human questions around the socio-biophysical drivers of global change. So I founded the Critical Ecology Lab, which is a nonprofit organization, in early 2020 with my collaborator Kunal Palawat. And around the same time or shortly after, I was really super grateful to receive the Osher Fellowship at the California Academy of Sciences, which is sort of a thinker in residence, jack of all trades researcher position that has allowed me to collaborate with some amazing curators at the Cal Academy. So that's where I am now. And so I'll say a little bit more about the Critical Ecology Lab. Oh, excuse me. I wanted to share also that another important and formative experience for me when I was a PhD student at Cornell was to help create this amazing program called the Diversity Preview Weekend. We call it the DPW, and the DPW is a program that I co-founded with my good friend Kate McDonald, where we essentially observed the homogeneity of applicants to our E&EB program, that the statistics showed that year after year, we were receiving only pretty much applications from white prospective students and very little diversity both in the applicant pool and in the admitted pool. And so as an intervention to that, and myself also being the only Black student at that time, I felt deeply that there would be not only this important impact on the lives of the students, but also on the culture of our department and the university at large if we recruited students more actively from underrepresented backgrounds and insisted that they felt as welcome and prepared to apply to an elite university as any other student. So I'm really proud that wonderful people at Cornell have continued this program long after my graduation. So Cornell DPW, please check it out and please suggest your students apply. So what is the Critical Ecology Lab? Many of you are familiar, some of you are familiar with me. I said a bunch of things about myself. I want to introduce my kind of right-hand person, Kunal. They are a soil science master's PhD student at the University of Arizona in Tucson with the lab of Dr. Monica Ramirez Andriota. We also work with a number of supporting master's and undergraduate students. And we have some wonderful collaborators from places like UCLA and UC Berkeley, NYU, as well as a number of non-scientific organizations like nonprofits and creative outlets. And I just want to express gratitude for the advice and support of our advisory board so far. But that does not tell you what the Critical Ecology Lab is, so I will do that now. So as I mentioned, our group is a nonprofit organization focused on research and social change relating to the social dimensions of environmental change. Like a traditional research group in a university, we do collaborative peer-reviewed research, relying on advanced techniques, both empirical and analytical. We work with undergraduates and graduate students for mentorship and advising, and we are working to organize workshops and conference sessions relating to this topic of critical ecology. On the other hand, we are also an organization expressly focused on radical social change and anti-oppression. And what that means is that by being separate from other institutions like universities or other research institutions, we allow ourselves to set our own culture of anti-oppression and dedication to human liberation. And I think through this talk, you will see more what I mean by that in more practical and applied terms. So one of the most important things I want to share here before I get into research is that our lab has these tenets, kind of norms of engagement that we set out every time we meet, every time we interact. We like to kind of reiterate these tenets to ourselves, and I'll just read them now so that you know where my group stands. So first, we commit to growth that accompanies discomfort. So putting ourselves in conversations and situations that may make us uncomfortable, but will allow us to grow both as people and as researchers. We honor Indigenous histories and futures and acknowledge that our work is only made possible in the United States through the extirpation of Indigenous peoples, and we support movements for land back to all Indigenous people. We insist that the rate of healing in our collective space actually exceeds the disturbance rate, And what we mean by that, though borrowing from sort of ecological language, what we mean is that we acknowledge that all of our members and folks that interact with our group experience disturbance of all sorts, personal, societal, etc. And so we insist that our space be a place where people can heal both, emotionally and interpersonally, but also allow that to support their growth as thinkers. We want to cultivate independence built from genuine compassion for one another. We validate and listen to one another in our meetings. That means that we insist on dissolving hierarchies as much as possible. And then we not only acknowledge, but kind of rejoice at the fact that there are multiple ways of knowing. So not only the Western science model, but so many others. And we want to privilege all of those ways of knowing as we develop our questions and our hypotheses. And we welcome the emergence of boundary-breaking questions. So through kind of living these tenets, we hope that we will give rise to really interesting emergent questions that we wouldn't have without holding these values closely. So just want to share those with you all. And before I move on to the research, I want to acknowledge that, as I said, all of our research is dependent on access to land that is not ours, oftentimes without the consent of Indigenous people. And so I want to acknowledge that the data that I share with you today will be, has been collected on Hawaiian sovereign land. And I want to acknowledge again that we support struggles for land sovereignty for Indigenous people. And we encourage you all to think about where your work has been conducted and the human histories that have come before in order to facilitate your access to research sites in the field and locally. Right, so to orient you to my talk today, I'm gonna first talk about my effort in situating what anthropogenic means in terms of ecosystem change processes. I will then go on to share some current, my perspectives on current approaches to critical science. I will move on to share how we might observe these processes of human interactions with nature and be critical about those processes in alternative ways. And specifically, I'll finally introduce critical ecology as a concept and offer ways that you may be curious to apply it to your own research. So first, I know that everybody knows what global environmental change is, but I'm still going to do this just to make sure we're all on the same page. So when I say global environmental change, I'm simply referring to the biotic and abiotic changes in the environment occurring as a result of human activity. And when I think of anthropogenic or use anthropogenic, I'm referring to simply the changes resulting directly from human choices and actions. And I may or may not bring up the Anthropocene, but I think that it's important to acknowledge kind of the language of this time and think about how that word has been conceived and how it's been applied. So I'm referring to the current interval of time in which on the earth in which many key processes are really influenced by human activities, what we do, and that's coming from Sensu Kurtzen at 2002. My goals for this talk will be first to just let you know what I do, right? Give you all an introduction to my work on fundamental ecosystem processes. I will share kind of how mainstream framing of climate change and environmental change tends to allow us to misrepresent the drivers of ecological change and really miss opportunities for intervention. And finally, I'm going to offer an alternative lens, as I said, a critical lens for investigating and evaluating global change dynamics, which I think regardless of your specialization in ecology or ecosystem science, you're thinking about global change. Right. So for context, I want to share something that I think about and that kind of frames my what excites me and what interests me in basic science is thinking about resource availability as it is linked to ecological traits. So what I mean by that is I think about ecosystems, as many of you do, in terms of the resources that are provisioned for the biotic elements of that ecosystem. So in low resource environments, where what I mean by that is the lower availability of nutrients, of moisture, cooler temperatures, and therefore lower metabolic rates overall, those resource conditions often are related to things like lower rates of respiration, slow growth rates, high C to N carbon to nitrogen ratios of tissues, greater tendency towards defenses, et cetera. These systems oftentimes are dominated by ectomycorrhizae or ectomycorrhizal species rather than arbuscular mycorrhizal species. And we kind of tend to describe the nutrient cycles of these systems as closed. In comparison to systems where resources are highly available, so high nutrient bioavailability in soils, warmer temperatures, greater precipitation, et cetera, we see sort of the opposite in terms of these traits that I just described. So arbuscular mycorrhizal dominant with more open nutrient cycles, with lower plant carbon to nitrogen ratios, and so on. So I won't belabor this. I'm pretty sure that I'm literally preaching to the choir. And so I give this to contextualize the way that I've been kind of oriented to research questions. And I'm going to share just a couple of examples of the types of questions that I have asked vis-a-vis basic science in the past. So one study that I will kind of give a little bit of background about ask the questions, do mean annual temperature, or MAT, and nitrogen bioavailability in soils covary predictably if all other variables are held constant? And then secondly, do the nitrification gene abundance or expression explain soil nitrogen bioavailability across mean annual temperature? So I won't share all of the results or background or kind of how this study was conducted for time, but I'll share that this was conducted on the Big Island of Hawaii on the Mauna Kea volcano, where I looked at mean annual temperature using an elevation gradient in the field, where things like vegetation composition, soil type, and precipitation pretty much were held constant across this gradient of 5.2 degrees Celsius. And so by looking at this natural laboratory that really only allows us to only isolate the effects of mean annual temperature, I was able to investigate these questions about nitrogen availability and cycling. And so just quickly, one result that was significant from this study, where we really were interested in how nitrate bioavailability and ammonium bioavailability were changing, we saw that the combined availability of these two species of nitrogen increased linearly with mean annual temperature, which was measured with ion exchange resins. So this first piece really just goes to show that temperature, so warming temperature is kind of what I would lump into that high resource availability category. It's an abiotic driver, and it appears to lead to the increased availability of this essential resource for plant productivity. So this is kind of one piece of, it's a very simple relationship, but that relationship is more becomes more interesting when we think about the genes that regulate nitrification, which produces bioavailable nitrate. And so I'm looking at the AMOA gene, which encodes the enzymes necessary for nitrification. We see that the copy number of that gene increases also linearly with temperature. So you can kind of sub out that x-axis here, as I showed you before, for mean annual temperature. And so the mechanism or the gene in this case is more abundant, and that is corresponding to the product of that process, which is nitrate. And so this is really interesting again, because this was a really huge spatial expanse that we looked at, and that kind of relationship, observing that in the field, was very interesting, and kind of goes towards this idea that with increasing bioavailability, or excuse me, with increasing temperature, nitrogen bioavailability is increasing. Now, even though I'm showing you basic science right now, I'm going to also give you like a sort of critical perspective about the observations that we made. So from departing from that basic science, I would say human activities are leading to atmospheric warming, as we know, which directly influence ecosystem processes like resource availability of nitrogen. But what we would also say is that, or what I would also say is that the relationship between human activity and functional gene abundance is something to pay attention to, right? Like, even though I didn't measure a direct human activity and its direct impact on gene abundance, we know that that warming is the result of increased fossil fuel burning. And so this is sort of this distal interaction between human activities and this really specific kind of ecosystem property, which is the abundance of a functional gene. And so just by taking this critical perspective, I may come up with sort of new questions and new ways of framing hypotheses about the relationship between human activities and things like soil microbial activity. Another study that I did previously and would also be kind of interesting to think of in this critical perspective frame is, does warming drive greater fine root colonization by arbuscular mycorrhizae? So we know that arbuscular mycorrhizae are symbiotic with the majority of terrestrial plants, and is a necessary partner in acquisition of phosphorus and also nitrogen. And so arbuscular mycorrhizae are these interesting organisms to think about because they really mediate acquisition of resources, and their presence may kind of indicate how productive an ecosystem can be, right? So looking at that on the same island system with that 5.2 degrees Celsius temperature gradient, I looked at the colonization of fine roots of total ecosystem plants using mesh cores. What we found here is, these cores were also fertilized, and I'm not going to show the results of the fertilization treatments on other root parameters, but I just want to kind of give you a little snapshot of the study to show that increasing temperature led to increased percent colonization of fine roots in this system. This was basically unrelated to the fertilization treatments inside those cores. So regardless of fertilization, temperature seems to drive fine root colonization of arbuscular mycorrhizae. And this is interesting because in my perspective, we can make that basic conclusion of temperature appears to drive colonization. And there are a number of kind of interpretations of what that means in terms of carbon availability and carbon allocation to arbuscular mycorrhizae by plants in the system. But we might also frame the result of this study in terms of fossil fuel capitalism, right? So increasing fossil fuel capitalism and increasing combustion of fossil fuels, among other activities, has led to increased atmospheric CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And this is really driving mean annual temperature increases. And so I think this is an important reframing of this result could be that that forest carbon and nitrogen stoichiometry and nutrient acquisition strategies are biophysical reflections or responses of this capitalist dependency on fossil fuels. And so for some of you, this is a huge jump to make, but my kind of question or desire to kind of trouble that comfort with a traditional link between one driver and one response is to say that in order to conceive of the relationships between human activities such as fossil fuel burning and the result in terms of increased mycorrhizal colonization in response to warming mean annual temperature, we need to make kind of conceptual relationships before we make those empirical or statistical relationships. And so these are just examples of kind of how I reframe basic science. And this is really important to me because doing this kind of thinking around the basic science results of my work has allowed me to shift my own perspective and bring you the perspective that I'm sharing today. So I'll move on to get into that. So I already showed you this slide, which frames kind of my thinking around high to low resource spectra, I guess, and the fast, slow traits that kind of operate along that spectrum of resource availability. And just as I showed you kind of alternative or critical perspectives to the results of a couple of my projects, I'll show you that a critical perspective of this spectrum would actually allow us to place human activity on, sort of superimpose it on that high-low resource spectrum. So with human activity, we see that, or with increasing human activity, ecosystems tend to be driven further to the right on this spectrum towards the high resource side. And what I mean by that is because of the increased synthesis of reactive nitrogen by human activity, increased atmospheric CO2 resulting from that, and fossil fuel combustion, both our direct and indirect influences on nitrogen fixation in various ways, and the warming feedbacks that kind of result from these temperature increases. All of these are kind of symptoms of the types of activities that humans do, right? And they also correspond with or fit into the suite of traits that we see in high resource systems. Whereas on the low resource side of the spectrum, human activity appears to kind of drive things like the encroachment of woody species in drylands. We see the losses of slow growing species with warming. So I think that it's a useful way to start to think about like an alternative way to think about how humans are really affecting global change, because really our goals are to make useful generalizations about kind of patterns that are occurring in the natural environment with relation to human activity. And so this is one of the ways that I make these generalizations, and this helps me to frame some of my questions and hypotheses. And so next I'll just talk about my perspectives on kind of how current research and researchers approach critical science, and I'll also say a little bit more about what I mean by critical science. So I say approaches to critical science where there's smoke. What do I mean by that? Right. So here is kind of a very deep simplification of the way that I see kind of current environmental science framings of global change. So it's very linear. We think that there's human activity. We think that that human activity leads to some kind of physical change in the environment, such as an atmospheric chemical change like increased CO2. We see that there's a response in terms of global climate with warming. And then we kind of investigate all of these ecological and evolutionary perturbations that result from that biophysical change. Finally, we take the results of that study, and then we think about things like sustainability, management, technical or engineering interventions. And then we also think about economic strategies if we're particularly fancy in trying to address the results of this human activity and global change. And I want to acknowledge that a lot of previous research has pushed beyond this linear view of how environmental change happens and how we address it. So I want to kind of give acknowledgement to studies that have advanced urban ecology. I want to think about things like critical physical geography, which is a kind of more recent intervention, trying to add the empirical to the critical when it comes to the humanities of the environment. We see that there has been a lot of work and a lot of different perspectives, I want to say, around how we frame the relationship between human choices, right? Like human biases and our expectations of how the world should work, and how that then plays out onto landscapes. And I know a number of folks at the Carey Institute are pretty much the progenitors of that area of study. And so what I think that this identifies is sort of syndromes and specific types of human environments. But what I think that this tends to miss, though more recently I think there are some attempts to change this, is to really add in these these structural and kind of ideological backings for the activities and the choices that then kind of structure the landscape and the types of human activities that happen on it, right? So in this image here from this recent paper from Shell et al. In Science in 2020, they actually, in their conceptual figure, add in things like systemic biases as a concept at the base of their kind of framework for how ecological patterns are kind of propagated on an urban landscape. And I think this is one of the first really explicit call outs of things like systemic biases that then help shape society and therefore the activities that happen in it. And so I want to go beyond this. Like though I think all of this has been necessary to set up where we are today, I think that the next step for critical thinking around ecological change really necessitates a more deep and specific call out of these, we mean by systemic biases as Shell and their colleagues put it. So I say, you know, where there's smoke, and what I mean is our work so far has really been pointing out smoke and pointing out fires with relation to how humans and our biases and our ideas about how society should operate then influence environmental change, right? So we're just kind of saying, hey, like here's this example of the relationship between human activities and choices and environmental consequences. Sometimes we even use that identification of a problem to then help people, and that's kind of environmental justice, right? Identifying where there are fires, but really isolated, right? Isolated examples. And what we're interested in with critical ecology is going beyond putting out or identifying those fires and putting out those fires, but actually understanding kind of why the fire arose in the first place. So I'm going to hit you with a number of wordy slides, and I ask that you bear with me because there's going to be a good payout. So first of all, my contention is that scientific language is a barrier to critical measurement, right? The words that we use when we describe scientific questions, when we think about the language involved in even describing methods and the histories that allowed for that language to come about is important. So we take a number of rhetorical shortcuts in science, and those rhetorical shortcuts reflect a dominant and oppressive epistemology of global change, right? Epistemology of global change, meaning the way in which we conceive of global change as an emergent process on the planet really differs depending on what language you use, and that language really reflects one's understanding of the sources of the activities that have led to global change. Coded scientific language creates an environment of immunity for scientists and removes responsibility for deeper analysis. Now, what I mean by that is not that scientists feel no responsibility or personal implication in the problems of global change. What I mean by that is that a deeper critique of our activities as humans and by nature, our involvement in those activities as members of society can be evaded depending on language we use. So going back to my mention of the Anthropocene earlier, anthropogenic feels to me, and I think a number of critics would also say this in social sciences, is that it is a lexical bypass that allows us to make a blanket statement that humans in general writ large were involved in the processes leading to the global change that we are experiencing today. And that's simply not true. Anthropogenic is this kind of way of plastering over the nuances, the differences, the heterogeneity in human activities, and does not, because of its use, allows us to ignore deeper analysis of the specific human activities and therefore the specific human groups and ideologies that precipitated things like the fossil fuel industry itself. So some of those motivations that are kind of elided by anthropogenic as a word include white supremacy, racial capitalism, and settler colonialism, all of which were involved in the formation of the economy that, that is now driving global change as we study it. Epistemologies of oppression and liberation influence the patterns that we even conceptualize to measure. So what I mean by that is, if we don't have that understanding of, like what I just said, the sense that anthropogenic is kind of this way of plastering over more nuance vis-a-vis changes in the environment, we will pretty much not be able to think about novel types of questions relating human activity and ways of relating human activity to environmental change in the first place. Like, not only will we miss that there's this relationship, for example, between settler colonialism and ecological change, but we will in fact not come up with the right ways to pursue the questions related to that relationship and methods of measuring that relationship. And so my contention is that snapshots or case studies of socio-ecological systems don't allow us to construct broader theories about connections between social ideologies and ecological change, right? So what we need, in my view and in the view of critical ecology, is a kind of clear epistemology of global change. And I think that that can only arise if we examine the ways that these human forces, these ideological forces, and these power dynamics have shaped society and therefore ecological change. And last, I'll say that shifting the epistemology of global ecological change will allow us to scale the social theory through space and time. Right, one of the biggest limitations of kind of the separation of social science and natural science is that the rhetorical or the theoretical is difficult to apply to the complex dynamics of heterogeneity in time and space that we study as natural scientists. And without that relationship between the theory and the measurement, we really cannot kind of move forward in terms of nuancing and adding critical theory to environmental change studies. So understanding oppression as a spatio-temporal field, right? Rather than a snapshot, for example, like a point source of pollution, we must think about oppression not as a point source, but as a two-dimensional or three-dimensional space in which ecological change happens. So we want to provide a social landscape, we want to examine the social landscape in which the ecological landscape develops. Scaling critical ecological patterns will allow us not only to do retrospective analyses of environmental change, but may also allow us to be predictive and therefore preventative in future examples of social ecological harm. So that's something that's the eventual goal for me. It's not what I'm working on right this second, but that is the kind of vision for critical ecology that I hold. And so just finally, traditional framings of global ecological change appear to me incomplete in that they ignore these deeper social drivers of biophysical change, which include things like our social norms and values, right? Our patterns of movement, which are really, ultimately influenced by these colonial and empirical activities that have happened in the past and influence the present and future. Patterns of resource extraction, right? Like through capitalism, the patterns of resource extraction have really shaped how and where ecological change happens at that basic biophysical level. And violence and oppression can be viewed as socio-ecological mechanisms. We're very interested in not only patterns, but the mechanisms that underlie those patterns. And we must come to develop new approaches, methodologies that frame violence and oppression mechanistically rather than just rhetorically or theoretically. So what I'm offering here is a framework, and I think, I hope I have enough time. I'm so sorry if I should be watching that, Michelle or Bella, please just let me know. So I've kind of gone to reorganize the drivers or the definitions of global change drivers here. And this kind of inverted triangle system has been useful for me and others in thinking about how to really nuance basic science questions. So a primary driver in this system is, or in this framework, is a biophysical factor, right? A direct driver of environmental change might be something like a change in pH or temperature, as I was describing earlier today. And this is what where we typically intervene as researchers. But just above the biophysical relationships would be this kind of secondary driver, which is the human activity. And I think ecologists very much get into the secondary drivers as well, thinking about things like patterns on the landscape, gradients of urban to rural, for example, thinking about the distribution of point sources of pollution, thinking about the influence of toxics being dumped into waterways. Those are sort of direct human actions that drive those biophysical changes that we directly measure. And then finally, there's this tertiary level, and this is where I think folks are really not only not familiar, but kind of uncomfortable in engaging with this because it feels less empirical. It feels less aligned with the scientific method. But my contention is that without thinking about social systems and the logics that motivated those human activities, so not just measuring kind of the fluxes of CO2 to the atmosphere, but thinking about the distribution of specific sources of CO2 that we can measure, right? Thinking about perhaps the spread of or the increases in fossil fuel drilling, where that's happening, when that's happening, and why that is happening, we might better connect these high level ideas to down to that basic biophysical factor. And I believe that this is a way that we can present questions and results of scientific studies in the future without losing anything, is what I would contend. And in fact, doing ourselves a favor by allowing us to see patterns that we wouldn't otherwise. And I could have clicked through all of these, and now you've seen me do it. So this is just to kind of put this point a little more finely. Sustainability and conservation are our typical responses to how we're supposed to deal with the catastrophic environmental changes that we're experiencing in all areas of the planet, terrestrial, marine, atmospheric, et cetera. And that is insufficient without a different intervention here between the relationship between ecological change and past and present social harm, right? So past and present social harm give rise to things like the fossil fuel industry, this extractive kind of capitalist economy, and the biophysical changes. And what we need to do, global environmental change will continue to disproportionately harm populations such as people of color, immigrants, the poor. Those social harms will continue to happen in tandem with ecological harm if we are not able to address what precedes that factory cartoon, the human activity. So quickly, I think I have enough time, and if I don't, again, please tell me, because I didn't set a timer. I'm going to describe what I mean by critical ecology and give an example of a study that I and my collaborators are doing, working on right now, that kind of applies this framework. So critical ecology is sort of let's see, a development from traditional ecology in that it relies on the same methods, the same types of tools, instrumentations, and of course the basic kind of scientific method, but adds in our ability to be critical in terms of the context of the biophysical question, and allow the results of the biophysical question to also more deeply inform our social understanding. So this example is a study on slave-based monocultures in the Dutch colony of St. Croix, or Dutch and Danish colony of St. Croix, I should say. St. Croix is part of the Caribbean. It is a small island, and it received about 26,000 slaves during the time of slavery on that island. Our questions are how enslavement of Africans for sugarcane monoculture cultivation and refinement has spatially influenced the soil structure, soil structure and organic carbon content of soils on St. Croix within the footprint of the estate Little Princess Plantation, which is currently owned by the Nature Conservancy. I'm interested in kind of the soil structure and kind of specifically the influence on plant community structure of this sugarcane monoculture over time. So what I'm doing here is relating soil structure and plant community function change over time to the transatlantic slave trade. And I use this framework to kind of make that relationship clear, right? So the primary drivers of environmental change in this case would be this change in land use and the kind of colonial practices for cropping and tillage and planting, the frequency of planting, et cetera, that influence the soils and the vegetation directly. So we are going to be using kind of basic methods, physical and chemical analyses of soils to look at elemental composition. We're also looking at using carbon and nitrogen isotopic evidence for understanding how plant community function shifted and when that shifted and the duration of that shift from this kind of vibrant, complex vegetation structure to the monoculture and then back again following the end of slavery. And we will use also radiocarbon dating for plant tissues in soils, as well as those that have been preserved. And I should say, what makes this kind of unique is that we as ecologists and biogeochemists are collaborating directly with archaeologists and anthropologists who are experts on this specific plantation, who have done archaeological digs for many years and understand kind of this broader colonial history. And so in that secondary driver area, we're going to be using the colonial botanical records that have been dug up from archives by our archaeologist colleagues. We'll use documents about planting techniques and tillage. We will use other archaeological evidence for thinking about what vegetation was present at the time of the transition to slavery and monoculture. And all of those pieces of evidence are kind of part of those secondary drivers, like the direct human activities that led to those biophysical changes. And then over all of that, we are thinking about how the importing of enslaved humans from Africa, the population of people and the times at which those populations were brought in and their labor was used to make these biophysical changes on the landscape. That is our umbrella driver, and we're thinking about the transatlantic slave trade as a tertiary driver of environmental change on this island. And what we hope to do with all of this is not just say, here's what happened on this specific plantation on St. Croix, but rather to develop a set of methods and kind of approaches that can be applied to other islands and other locations that have experienced slavery as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, and have also kind of been part of these extractive economies for things like sugar, tobacco, indigo, and otherwise. And so this is to create a broader theory of how the activity of the transatlantic slave trade has shaped the ecology of the Americas. And so that's the relationship more generally that we want to make, and kind of looking for a better understanding of what a syndrome of slave plantations means for terrestrial ecology. I already showed you that. Why am I showing it to you again? And so just to wrap up, I want to just reiterate that the critical ecological perspective is this. First, that we want to radically center caring and relationships to one another, the environment to science, as well as action in our communities. And that is as important as being experts in the technical work that we do. We value that different epistemologies have had differential but also synergistic impacts on measuring environmental change. So the way that we think about the kind of how environmental change has come about, the epistemology of that change, which I've really shared with you here today as and made clear my epistemology of global change, influences what we measure and how we do that. Oppression and liberation can be mapped, measured, and constructed or deconstructed. And I think that this, I hope that my work from here going forward not only helps to illustrate that, but really helps to make legible and also tractable studies of oppression with relation to ecological change for everyone. And that's kind of my mission here. And finally, we want to strive to dismantle the systems that necessitate our work. I don't want to be having to do this 50 years from now. I hope that by applying a critical ecological perspective, I'm going to be able to start to reveal some of the relationships between the histories of our country, of colonization, of oppression and extraction, and the ways that that has really brought us to this ecological brink that we're facing. And I hope that by doing this work, it will no longer be necessary in the future. So with that, I'll just conclude and thank Michelle and Bella again for a really sweet invitation, and thank you all for sticking around.
Awesome. That was such a wonderful talk, Sue. I think we all have a lot to think about. Really brilliant. And we have a few questions in the Q&A. I'll read them to you, or you can, I guess, also read along since some of them are kind of long. The first question is, if you'll be willing to reflect on some of the lessons you've learned from doing work outside of the academy and how it has been starting up a lab independent of those structures. It's obvious that a space can be really generative. What are some hurdles or opportunities you've experienced with setting up Critical Ecology Lab?
Okay, thank you for that question. I think, let me make sure I understand. So my experiences outside of academia in general, or yeah, I guess, as I mentioned, I started this diversity preview weekend, and I didn't say a ton about like the background of that, but like I don't do diversity and inclusion work. I've never wanted to. I know that that is like the important like vogue thing right now is doing DEIJ, etc. And while I think that that's entirely necessary, and I'm not scoffing at it in any way, I think it's often assumed that like by doing that work, it means that that's something that I want to do, and it never was. And so I guess the experience of frustration around having to create a diversity preview weekend, which grad students came up with, found funding for, recruited for, organized, executed, etc., on behalf of an Ivy League university, was one of my first, I wouldn't say first, but one of the most salient experiences that led me to believe that in doing any work that we seek to be transformative, we may have to do it ourselves, and we may have to do it outside of structures that are straightforward and are supportive. And so I'm actually just comfortable with not having the scaffolding of traditional institutions. And so that's where that comes from. And as far as lessons, I've learned that there are funky ways of doing the work that you want to do when you cannot find a place that is appropriate to do that work. And you will find that there are incredible and brilliant young researchers that will come and support you and will kind of understand the necessity without you having to explain it. So that's my answer.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more question, so I'll go ahead and read it. One attendee asked, have you heard or supported the term, have you heard of the term Capitalism instead of Anthropocene, or is that too myopic? And have you considered using that term before?
Yeah, the term that they're referring to, Capitalism, is kind of, maybe some of you've heard, is this like alternative verbiage for really invoking the fact that capitalism, not humans in general, are responsible for kind of generating this new geologic epoch. And I don't use it, but I know about it, and I think that it's a useful critique that that word exists. Another word that maybe folks are not or less familiar with is plantationocene. That word has, I believe, Professor Anna Singh at UC Santa Cruz was one of the first people to use plantationocene, which rather than just identifying capitalism, really specifically identifies what kind of started capitalism in the United States, which was the creation of the plantation. And our modern capitalism that Capitalocene tries to identify would be nothing without the labor of enslaved people that was never paid for. So I think I prefer plantationocene to Capitalocene, and I also don't use any of them because I think there's just so much more that we don't understand about this relationship that I hope critical ecology will help to expose.
Great. I think that's all the time we have for questions, but for those of you that did ask questions, please leave your email address and we can give all the questions to Sue at the end and she can respond back. Thank you so much. And a recording will be made of this talk as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle.